On the 3rd of September 1939, which was the day the war started, I went into Oxford and was signed up as a second lieutenant in the Oxford and Bucks Light Infantry. I was 18, and a couple of days later there was a letter came in, they wouldn't take me, I was too young. So that was the end of the Oxford and Bucks Light Infantry. In August 1940, I received what was called a calling up notice, which required me to report to Badbrook Barracks in Warwick, the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. And on the 15th of August, I remember it very vividly, my mother and father drove me into Warwick. A picture, I've got a photograph of me on the lawn here with a very small suitcase before starting off. We lived in a barrack room. The first thing we did was to load a sack with straw, which was our bed, called a palliasse, and collect some blankets. So we slept on the straw, in the blankets, no sheets, no pajamas, nothing like that. It was a fairly rough life, but it was probably quite a good breaking in. Then I got very bored at Warwick because we spent most of our day doing drill on the square or route marches or PT exercises. It got very boring. You see, there's very little in the way of modern equipment then. It was after Dunkirk, it had mostly been lost. The army had very little in the way of Bren gun or modern carriers that they could use. And then I got sent off after about 6 months, 8 months there. I got sent to an officers' training unit run by the Guards in Bulford in Wiltshire. That was fairly hard work. We weren't allowed to walk. We had to run everywhere all the time. So then I became an officer in the Rifle Brigade in 1941 as a second lieutenant. And I served at the training battalion for about 6 months. And then about the end of 1941, I was sent to what was the 8th Battalion, the Rifle Brigade, stationed in Scarborough. And I remember in Scarborough in the winter, you used to go in the night to inspect the sentries, and walking down the front of the North Bay, you had to hold on to the railings or else you got blown into the sea. One got to know the whole atmosphere of the Rifle Brigade people. They were all, this was the London Rifle Brigade, they'd all come from the City of London, Lloyd's and that sort of thing. And they were good, small, active, clever Cockneys. And I couldn't have asked for better. Then moving into 1942, if you like, we always expected we were going to go somewhere. We trained to go to North Africa. We had embarkation leave and all that sort of thing, and we went up to Liverpool to embark for North Africa. And then the message had come through from higher command that they wanted more infantry and not more armour, so we were sent back again. That was a very low point, if you like. We spent most of the next year in camp, either Newmarket, we spent a lot of time there in Suffolk, Aldershot, Brighton for a time, and then in the run-up to D-Day we were at Aldershot, actually. And of course by then one was fully aware that there was going to be an invasion. We were trained for it, and indeed our vehicles were all what was called waterproofed. That is, they had a special treatment so that you could drive them through the water without them flooding. And I remember the onset of D-Day, the first thing one noticed on D-Day was all the planes had white lines on them, which was never seen before, all the British planes, obviously.
The Allied airborne force formed the spearhead of invasion. Each plane carries the special invasion markings. the broad black and white stripes for easy identification by our own airmen.
We went on board the ship at Tilbury, pretty old ship it was too, and it took all our vehicles and the whole of the battalion, which was perhaps 800 men, and we sailed at dusk down the Thames and returned round past Dover, crept along the shore there, knowing that the German guns were not very far away on the French coast. And then we got out into the Channel and in the darkness, and all that night we sailed down the Channel, and then we were off the Normandy beaches at the early hours of the morning, and it was an incredible sight. There were hundreds of vehicles of ships of one sort or another, from battleships to naval ships to troop carriers, and almost all of them had big barrage balloons, they were called, floating at the top of them in order to prevent low-flying German aircraft from attacking them. And I remember way on the left was the battleship Warspite, which was the First World War battleship, a big one, and it fired its 15-inch guns on shore, and they made a hell of a bang. You really shook the whole place up. But it all lent atmosphere to the occasion, and then you knew that you were going to land and face the Germans. And we very much expected to see Germans being nasty to us, but there weren't any. It was very quiet. Then when we got on shore, we drove for a few miles, again thinking there would be Germans, but there weren't, because the front line was then about 5 miles back. And we went into a sort of wooded area and parked there for not only the night. It turned out we were parked there for about 4 days, I should think, and you could hear the sound of the fighting going on a few miles away. I was what's called adjutant, which was the man who did jobs for the colonel, if you like, and I was taken with the colonel to see where the fighting was going on. It was the first time I heard a shell flying overhead, which was quite an experience, an experience one got very used to later on. And after a few days there, we were primed up for the first battle round Caen, and it was known as Operation Epsom. And the idea was to pinch out Caen, which was a vital place, and clear it to the Germans. And that involved going onto a hill. It was known as Hill 112, 112 feet, which doesn't sound very high, but on a flat bit of country, 112 feet was very dominant of Caen. And whoever occupied 112 controlled Caen, which was the main focus point of the German armies. And once we got up there, all hell was let loose, because the Germans were determined to defend it, and they shelled us from, there was a place called Carpiquet Aerodrome, which had some very big guns on it, and they shelled us from there and from everywhere. And the idea of to defend yourself is to dig a nice hole, what's called a slit trench, but you try and dig a slit trench there. The Caen stone is about 3 inches down, and you got through the top 3 inches all right, and then that was about it. And for 2.5 days we just endured there, wondering if the Germans were going to come and actually attack us, but just putting up with the shelling. And then after this few days, the higher command realized that we were in an exposed position. We were liable to be cut off from the sides by a German. We were in a salient, if you like. So they withdrew us back over the River Odon. But we lost a lot of men. I think we lost 60 or 70 men on Hill 112. And it was a fairly rough baptism of fire. Nothing ever seemed quite so terrible after 112. You felt inevitably pretty frightened once you have a shell falling near you or anywhere near you. It's an alarming experience. And they had some things called mini-werfers, which were rockets, a packet of rockets, 6 or 8, which had a whistle on there, and a hell of a noise. the damage they did was much less than the noise, which was very frightening. So you had these things coming at you. And how did you feel? Pretty frightened, yes, pretty frightened. And then clearly seeing people you'd known for years getting killed or wounded was hard. But equally, the pressures were so great that you didn't have too much time then to think about that. 112 was on the west side of Caen. The next battle was on the other side of Caen, the east side, to try and cut it off from there. It was known as Operation Goodwood. And I remember we had to go across and cross the River Orne and line up the other side. And I was told to reconnoitre the route and to lead the battalion across. It was a mile or two. And dawn in June, of course, was pretty early. There was a 1,000 bomber raid in front of us, and you saw the planes coming in from behind you and dropping their bombs just ahead of us, fortunately just ahead of us. And one felt that there was enormous damage being done. For the first mile or two, it was all pretty quiet, and then you came into a lot of shelling and opposition, and the 88mm guns that the Germans had, which were very effective against tanks, you started to see the tanks on fire, and that was a horrific sight. And we must have advanced 5 or 6 miles probably. This was open cornfields, and Caen, we were cutting off Caen, and then it all came to something of a halt. We, as a battalion, we attacked 2 villages called Bras and Hubert-Folly, which were 2 smallish villages, but on a crucial point on a hillside, and we captured both of them, and that was that for that day. And then the next day the battle was resumed, but didn't make much headway, and then torrential rain came, and that was the end of Operation Goodwood. A limited success. We'd advanced a long way, but Caen was still not cut off properly. When we were pulled back, I then went into Caen, and there was enormous damage, and I went into the Abbey des Hommes, which was the great cathedral of Caen, with thousands of people sheltering in there. It had been hit by a bomb, but it hadn't been demolished in any way. But yes, seeing a town that's been bombed to that degree is pretty horrific, really. Now, I didn't go fighting Germans. I really controlled things. I sat on the wireless. I had 2 wirelesses. One went to the companies in my battalion, and the other went back to the brigade headquarters. And then I would go on the other wireless and instruct the companies where they were to go and do. So I sat in this white scout car, which was semi-armoured, but hidden in a way from what was going on. They were hearing a lot of what was going on, but not actually fighting, if you like to put it that way. Our vehicle, I can remember in that Operation Goodwood, we were right at the front, and there were tanks all around us, some burning. And I remember a particular occasion when a tank was firing and doing some damage, and it transpired it was a British tank that had been knocked out but had been occupied by the Germans. So the order came over the wireless that all vehicles must have their guns pointing south, and if any were left pointing north, they'd be shot up. And of course the Germans didn't get that on the wireless, so everybody, but there's just one tank had its gun pointing north, and so that got shot up all right, I think. We then moved away to the west, Saint-Lô, on the map, and this was some miles to the west, and we were alongside the Americans there and launched an attack, and that's when it suddenly became fluid, you know. The Germans were largely withdrawing there, and we were able to move very quickly and consistently, and we moved across to a place called Le Beni-Bocage, which had been a scene of previous heavy fighting, and there we got up onto a ridge called Le Bas-Perrier, which is an exposed ridge. We were there for some days, and the Germans came in behind us, and so we were isolated for about 24 hours. It was fairly lonely, that was. It got shelled. And then there was the breakout, and then we did move forward. We're forward, and then we swung eastwards and really joined in what was called the Falaise Pocket, when the Germans were almost enclosed by a pincer movement, by Falaise, and we moved towards there. Suddenly things were liquid and moving instead of being boxed in. And it was soon after that we advanced on Amiens, and that was a remarkable occasion because we were expecting to stop for the night, and the orders came to that we'd got to go on through the night because the Germans were in such disorder. So we drove all through the night in country that was enemy territory, never knowing quite what happened. And before dawn we were outside the city of Amiens with the River Seine running through it. And that was an amazing sight. There were thousands of Germans surrendering. I mean, perhaps 10,000 in sort of chaotic situation and very little fighting. And so they were rounded up by people and taken away to the rear, I think. And we then crossed the River Seine. And so we went on through the rest of France and into Belgium, and then the next target was Antwerp, and we actually perhaps that was early September, we captured Antwerp, and there was no resistance much. The chief scene was all the girls with bunches of flowers and jollity, and it was all very nice.
Already at the windows, Allied flags appear. Then into the waiting streets rumble our armoured columns, to find Antwerp with its great docks and industrial installations virtually intact.
But we stopped at Antwerp, which I think military was probably a mistake because, you see, we had to be supplied from Caen. So all our petrol, all our rations, all our ammunition came all the way up from Caen. And that meant that to go pushing on, which we ought to have done, would have had logistic problems, if you like. But I always think the war might have been over that autumn if we could have gone on then. After Antwerp, this is September, we moved on into Belgium, and then it became very wet and damp and very hard to move around. We spent a lot of time hanging around near Venray and Venlo, which was on the south of Belgium in the sort of marshy area. Very disagreeable it was. And all we did there really was hanging around. Germans were over there and neither side were very keen to attack the other. A certain amount of shelling, but nothing much happened really. I remember we used to put trip flares out at night so that if any Germans came, the trip flare would set them off or it'd shoot them. We were prepared for them, but there wasn't much active fighting. Come the end of the year, we were sent back to France to refit, to have new tanks and things. And when we got there, we were immediately told to turn around and go back because the Battle of the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulbs, had started. And we were sent back to the River Meuse, and we were to defend the bridges at Givet and Namur, and I forget what the third one was, 3 bridges, and we were waiting for the Germans to come through the Ardennes. But actually they effectively ran out of petrol. They never got to the Ardennes, never got to the Meuse. And then we moved into the Ardennes near Bastogne, where the Americans had been fighting, and we had a bit of fighting with Germans, but nothing very active. The snow was on the ground, it was very cold, and the Germans were really, they'd made this great push, but they'd run out of steam, or particularly they'd run out of petrol. And then in March was ready for the Rhine crossing, and we crossed the Rhine on pontoon bridges, which was obviously an exciting moment, if you like, because there we were going into Germany. I remember crossing the river in a small boat with my colonel to get to the other side, and one of those Stuka planes that you'd not heard of from the start of the war came over and dropped a bomb on us. We dropped far away, quite. But it was an uncomfortable moment. And for a day or so we were under pressure with our troops on the other side of the river. But then the Germans, they were very short of proper troops then. These were young people brought in, and they fell back. And then we moved on again. Moving across Germany, we had a message, or higher command had a message that we were to halt for 48 hours because there was the next place, people had typhoid there, and we must, so for better or worse, we stopped for 24 hours, and the place in question was Belsen, which we'd never heard of. I don't think many of us knew anything about concentration camps before we encountered them, really. And when we got to Belsen, I went with another chap, which there wasn't much fighting at all. I went with another chap, we went back into Belsen and saw all the horrors of it, if you like. And I don't need to exaggerate the horrors. I mean, there were dead people lying everywhere, people being eaten by animals or whatever. And then we went through huts with rows of people, terrible smell. We smoked all the time, trying to restrict the smell. You couldn't tell who was dead and who was alive. They were just lying in heaps of squalor. And then there was a great pit with hundreds of bodies in it. And some German soldiers around supposedly helping to clear up. But it was all as horrific as you could imagine, really. We really hadn't known about concentration camps before, but one doesn't need to know any more. It wasn't I don't think people got gassed there. They just were left to die, if you like. There was a lot of turnips lying around with people been eating them. That was probably all there was to eat. Terrible evil, great evil. And then after that we moved on, and very little opposition until we got towards the Hamburg area. And there, instead of going into Hamburg, we turned left and went up Schleswig-Holstein, and we were halfway up Schleswig-Holstein towards the Danish border when the war came to an end. And the last few weeks there was very little fighting, a lot of taking prisoners who were very happy to surrender, and a lot of passing German villages which were not perfectly happy. We were up at the top of Schleswig-Holstein, up towards the Flensburg, the Danish border, and one company, and I was by then a company commander, was sent to be in charge of the island of Silt, which is off the Danish coast. It's a sand dune. And I was made military commander at the age of 24 of the island of Silt. And it's a long sand dune and a lot of very good birds, and nothing else happened there at all. And you could only get there by railway. There was no other bridge. And we controlled the time of the train, so you knew who was coming or who wasn't coming. That was just very boring. We hung around there. And then, again, I was in Germany for a time and very bored. And I had the opportunity to go to Palestine. So I went to Palestine in 1946, I suppose. And I was in Jerusalem for some time. And then I had an administrative job in Palestine, in the headquarters Palestine. We worked in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. And my job was telling regiments to go here, there, or everywhere. And then we left Jerusalem when the British were coming out, and we went down to Haifa, and then eventually we sailed away from Haifa at the end of the British mandate in Palestine. And I found those years in Palestine, I find it interesting. It was always a little, I mean, you had to walk out in twos, and you always carried a revolver, it was a little bit. And if you drove over a bridge, you never quite knew if it was going to blow up or not. And I don't remember the discomforts of life particularly. I mean, we were very lucky that because we were a motor battalion, we had vehicles, so you could always sleep under the vehicle and have some kit in the vehicle, whereas the poor infantry didn't have vehicles to sleep in or under. So I don't think our discomforts were as great as other people's, if you like. You got very used to the general aspect of not washing very often, perhaps. Obviously, what I've been very interested in the whole history of what's going on. I remember how we studied in detail the attack on Crete and all that sort of thing, the Germans. We knew about the past history, but I don't think we'd much idea as to what was going to happen in Normandy. In fact, until the last minute, we didn't know where we were going, because it was obviously very secret. I think we all went into a land which was unknown to us, really. And you took day by day.